Hello y'all, welcome back to Case Can Probably Read. My name is Casey and I am most likely literate. It's time to wrap up June. I've done weekly wrap-ups for most of the other books that I've read. I just have 7 books to talk about. I'm also going to talk about a DNF. Then we're going to try to do some stats for the first time. Then just maybe some finishing thoughts for the month, and then we'll be done. So let's get this show on the road. All right, the first book that I actually want to talk about, an acquaintance of mine from college recommended me, a few books, but this is one that I read because it was short. And it is non-affirming. My thing is, if I'm going to be the type of person that champions reading books from multiple viewpoints and not just the one that I agree with, then that is something that I need to do. Just from a standpoint of trying to maintain my own personal integrity, my own personal values, I want to be that type of person who is not afraid to read outside of my agreements in my box. I want to make it clear that I don't agree with this standpoint, and I feel like there were a lot of holes in the argument, in the logic, and just in the rhetoric of this book. And because I know that there are some people who view this channel who are part of the LGBTQ community, I want to make sure if that is not something that you want to hear about, feel free to skip to this part of the video and you will not have to hear that. All right, the book that I read is God Anti-Gay and Other Questions About Homosexuality, the Bible, and Same-Sex Attraction. It is by Sam Allberry, who is, I think he's British, and I don't know if he is a minister, but I do know that he is what he prefers to call SSA, or same-sex attracted. I don't think he likes to be referred to as gay. So I am going to honor that. Sam Allberry is an SSA Christian, and he is someone who he believes that gay marriage and gay sex are sinful, and he believes that scripture supports that. I do have a lot of issues with Sam Allberry's arguments. First of all, a lot of the very basis of his argument depends on a complementarian definition of marriage, which, if you don't know what that means, it's this idea that men and women were created for different roles, that they're supposedly, equal, but women are made for the home, child rearing, tasks traditionally specific to womanhood, and men are made for leadership, being the head of the household, decision making, etc. There are plenty of people who believe there's biblical support for that view. I'm not one of them. And there are a lot of Christians who do not adhere to a complementarian view of marriage. I feel like a significant part of Allberry's argument hinged on that specific definition of view of marriage. Not to mention, he asserted that the only type of union that God blesses is a man and a woman in marriage. So not cohabitation. In one of the later chapters, he talked about two unmarried people living together as sin. That's a modern definition of marriage. I was discussing this with one of my friends, Caitlin, who brought up the point that there were times in history where legal marriage recognized by a government or by a state was not possible for every person. Not every person could afford to be married. That was something that was maybe reserved for upper classes or nobility. Peasantry had their own ceremonies. They had their own practices that were just as binding in their communities, but were not recognized by the state. He did go over some of the clobber passages, he said, specific to the Levitical scriptures, that it was made clear in the New Testament which ones of those old laws Christians are supposed to follow or not supposed to follow. Basically, the idea that it was God's moral law versus just what was cultural practice at the time. And he said we differentiate between those two today, and that's how we know which parts of Levitical law to still follow and not follow. There is absolutely, from my understanding, no measuring stick for that in the Bible that definitely says this is how we measure the moral code, this is how we measure any other type of code, and this is how we decide which ones we follow now and which ones we don't. That is a human addition from later Christianity. Now, he did advocate for greater understanding of gay Christians. He did advocate for compassion and empathy. He did make some vague arguments that churches should be safer for those Christians, which I think is a good thing, but it also failed to address statistics about LGBTQ suicide, especially teen suicide statistics, that make it pretty clear that the way that the church responds to LGBTQ people, especially teens, is not life-giving. It's not life-saving. And so I don't think you can ignore those statistics. I don't think you can ignore what this is doing to the LGBTQ community by churches remaining non-affirming. And he had no answers for that. Didn't even address it in his book about what do we do about these suicide statistics? How do we as a church try to make those numbers go down? It was really just repeating a lot of the same arguing points that I've heard throughout my life without adding additional information that made the argument stronger. I did appreciate the author's particular situation. I know that this is his experience and that for him, this may be how he wants to live out his life. I think he lives as a celibate Christian, as a celibate SSA Christian. Everybody has to live by their own convictions. And I do respect that he did address that the church does need to be better, but he didn't take it nearly far enough, in my personal opinion. And I did not find his arguments to be compelling at all. So that's a 1-star read. All right, so we get all the uncomfortable stuff out of the way right away. I'm going to go ahead and talk about a DNF that I had this week, which was Good Behavior by Kelly Fox. This is a complicated one for me. I like Kelly Fox. I do like what she writes and respect her writing and her storytelling. She does often write a lot of stories that ride that line pretty finely on morally gray characters or vigilantism. This is the Wild Hearts Ranch series. It follows a group of men who work on a ranch, but they also secretly are involved in rescuing people from human trafficking. The Good Behavior is like the second book in this particular series. It's supposed to be a forbidden romance, which I'm finding that a lot of books that are tagged as forbidden romance are not really turning out to be for me. But this particular one was supposed to follow an ex-convict who had been introduced in the previous book named Nacho, who has served his time. He got out early on Good Behavior, and he's gone to work for this fencing company in Texas. He had a therapist in prison whose name was Bram. I can't remember the guy's last name. The therapist was instrumental in helping Nacho achieve early release from prison. And so they've actually met sometime later on this Wild Hearts Ranch. Bram is now a therapist that works for the ranch, and he assists victims of trafficking. Their paths cross again. And I know that this was supposed to develop into a romance. I did not make it very far. It became clear in the first 2 chapters of the book that Bram and Nacho, even though they hadn't had like a sexual relationship while Nacho was in prison, they had an inappropriate one, and it was just on the wrong side of morally gray for me to enjoy. I want to be perfectly clear. Kelly Fox is really good about putting these kind of trigger warnings or content warnings in the front of her book. She lets you know, she says, hey, this book may not be for you because it deals with these issues. And I forgot to read that. I read it as an ebook, and so it started me on the first page of the actual novel instead of a couple of pages earlier with Kelly Fox's introduction and explanation. And so I feel like that was my fault. She did a fantastic job of explaining that. I should have read it. I don't necessarily have a problem with morally gray stories or stories that kind of ride that line. But this was just one particular one that fell into an area that I was not interested in reading about. So I DNF'd that one like at 7%. So I just want to be clear again. I like Kelly Fox. This book is just not for me. And I feel like she's pretty good about understanding that about her readers. I didn't give it a star rating because I didn't finish it. The first book I did finish this week was The Bond Cut Omega by Amy Bellows. I'd read two of Amy Bellows' books last week. And so this is from a different series than the one that I read. The last one I read was a shifter romances about foxes, and they were part of Omegaverse fiction. This is also Omegaverse fiction, but it's non-shifter. It's a best friends to lovers romance, and it does involve impreg. It's just about two friends named Gabe and Marcus. They met in juvie when they were teenagers, and they just sort of formed this really tight friendship bond that's continued into adulthood. And it's become romantic on both of their sides, but they're not willing to risk their friendship. But Gabe in particular, he's the omega part of this pairing, and Marcus is the alpha. Gabe is what's called a bond cut omega, because when he was a teenager, he had his scent gland damaged so that he couldn't be bonded to an alpha because he was also a sex worker. He doesn't think that he's ever going to have any type of bond. He doesn't want to start anything with Marcus because he doesn't feel like he can offer Marcus anything. The status quo changes though when Gabe goes into heat and they end up having an accidental pregnancy. And so they decide that they're going to raise this baby together, and they decide that they're going to become bonded to each other in the best way that they can. And this book was surprisingly emotional. It was just kind of a beautiful story of found family and of finding your worth even when society seems to tell you that you don't have much, and discovering that you are a worthy human being. So I thought that there were a lot of really sweet themes in this book. I was surprised by it, and I rated it 3.75 stars. All right, the next book I read was Employing Patience, which is Divorced Men's Club Book 4 by Saxon James. This followed a character that we have, actually two characters that we had already met. Art is sort of the leader of the Divorced Men's Club. So he owns the main bar in town, and the other character in this romance is Joey Manning, who is a bartender at this bar. I like Saxon James. I just do. I like this series. I just like stories where people seem to think that the world is done with them, or that their life is over, and then they find out that it's not, and that they can still have friendship and love and family and all of that. That's one thing that I've really kind of craved lately, I think. And this book was big on that. Joey, in particular, he has raised both of his younger sisters because his parents were addicts. He didn't even finish high school, but he worked really hard to put both of his sisters through high school and through college. And so he's always tight on money. And Art always has more than enough money, and he's actually really into being a secret benefactor for several people throughout the town. And so it's kind of a cool little match right away. Joey is learning to accept help and to not have to do everything on his own. And Art is learning to love, and that he doesn't just have to be a forever bachelor and all that stuff. So, I mean, it's just a really cute series. I really liked the first book in this series. The other ones were good, but the first one and then this fourth one are probably in competition for my favorite books from the series, and I rated it 4.25. The next book that I read was Atlas, which is Mike Bravo Ops Book 3 by Eden Finley. Mike Bravo Ops is a security firm. They're all ex-military. They're the kind of people that you call when you need something done and you can't be connected to it. But they also just do regular security jobs and things like that. So this story followed Atlas, who is one of the members of this Mike Bravo company. And he is undercover at a strip club because Mike Bravo Ops has been hired to find out who is embezzling money from this strip club. The strip club is well known to be involved in drug trafficking and some other, pretty gross stuff. So it's not like this is an above board investigation, but while Atlas is working there, he meets a dancer named Lemon who has featured in, it was a spin-off novella. This is Lemon, who is definitely the embodiment of stripper with a heart of gold. So he has been at this particular strip club for several years, and he loves what he does, but he also is really committed to protecting the other dancers at the club. That's like his whole life's mission, is to be there for those, for the other dancers. And so him and Atlas end up crossing paths. Lemon discovers that Atlas is undercover, and they end up working together to sort of bring this case to a close, and then they end up falling in love in the process. And like I said, I think in my previous videos, these are action-packed books. These are ones that definitely every book involves like explosions or fires or somebody getting shot. So this is definitely kind of more of your Michael Bay feel for a novel. It was really cute though. This stripper with a heart of gold in this context was kind of a fun little trope to use, and it was a good little book. I liked it, and I rated it 3.75 stars. And then the next book I read was JON'S Crazy HEAD-BOPPIN Mystery. And this was JON'S Mysteries Book 2 by A.J. Sherwood. This is the one that follows John the Psychic. He works for a private detection agency who consults with the police a lot. In the last book, he met his anchor, whose name is Dominic, and they also didn't just form a psychic relationship, they also formed a romantic relationship. These are kind of your typical episodic crime stories. The particular mystery in this one is that someone is attacking women when they're leaving work by hitting them on top of the head, and the perpetrator has attacked several women, and they've all survived, but recently there began to be fatalities in these attacks. So John and Dominic and several other people from their group have to go consult with this police department where these crimes are happening. And the issue is that in this particular police department, they're not very understanding or accommodating for psychics. They expect them to do things that are not possible. They try and bully them into going beyond what they're able to do, what's healthy for them in order to solve the crime. And so it's kind of a fun new conflict that was different from the conflict that was in the previous story. And then also you have a lot of the subplot that has to do with Dominic and John's relationship, because they're still kind of working through some of John's hangups from his past. So that was just a little piece of the plot here in this book. And it's a fun book. I like these because they're not too heavy. They're not too serious. They're not too gory either. It's like watching, you know, one of a more humorous crime show. I rated this one 3.5 stars. All right, the next one that I read was also by Amy Bellows, and it is A Pebble for Lewis, which sounds like a children's book, but it is not. And this is from the Alaskan Pebble Gifters series by Amy Bellows. It's the first book in that series. This follows a polar bear shifter and a penguin shifter because why not? This is a best friends to lovers romance. It's set in Anchorage, Alaska. Lewis is a penguin shifter and Todd is a polar bear shifter. They actually meet when Lewis's dad goes to Todd to have his mating necklace removed because Lewis's other parent has abandoned them. So his dad wants to move on with his life, and in order to do that, he has to have his bonding pebble necklace removed from his neck. So they go to visit Todd, who is sort of like a jeweler, blacksmith. They meet there. They kind of immediately have an attraction to each other, and they end up exchanging numbers, and they become friends over video games. And at the time that they meet, they're 17 years old. And so they go through this friendship that eventually blossoms into romance, I think when they're 19 years old. Then they decide they want to be mated, which is a big step because polar bears and penguins are very much, they stick to their own kind. And so for a polar bear and a penguin shifter to mate is kind of a big deal. It was interesting. One thing that I am finding really fascinating, specifically about the Omegaverse, is how different authors use it to explore different ideas. So sometimes the author will focus more on breaking down, you know, gender binary ideas. I've seen, particularly in the Bond Cut Omega that I read, talked about a second ago, that some of the sub-themes in that book focus more on trans issues. One of the minor characters in that book was a doctor who was born as an alpha, but later transitioned surgically to become an omega. I just think it's interesting how much you can say by writing these type of stories. No two authors that I've read from Omegaverse fiction have had the same things to say. They each use it to go in a different direction, and I find that fascinating. That's kind of a cool little thing for, you know, a subgenre that's, you know, only about this big. I rated A Pebble for Lewis 3 stars. The last book I read is also a shifter impreg romance, and this one was called Alpha Dragon's Tiger by Hawke Oakley. I would say this is one of the more humorous offerings in this genre. Follows a tiger shifter named Taylor and a dragon shifter named Crimson. Now, Crimson is one of 7 brothers who are all dragon shifters and all alphas, and they live on their own private tropical island. And they decide, since they are so secluded, none of them have found mates yet, that they're going to hold like a bachelor-style reality show on their island in order to find mates for themselves. So they intend for this to be like a multi-season show, with each season featuring a different brother trying to find his mate. So this first book follows Crimson. I like these ones that are more humorous and that take a weird spin. I like a weird premise. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. And so the idea of combining a reality show with impreg fiction was, I couldn't pass it by because that's weird. It's just weird. So I'm really attracted to books like this. I think that's why I like A.J. Sherwood so much. We were introduced to a lot of characters that I think are probably going to show up in subsequent books. I don't love the title on this. For some reason, that's one of my bigger issues with this book, which is a weird thing. I just don't like this title. I feel like it could have been better. But I like I liked the story. I thought it was humorous. I actually really liked the cover art on this one. And I rated this one 3.25 stars. This is taking forever. So that is the complete rundown of the last week of June. And so now let's go ahead and let's go over some of my stats for June. I am literally just pulling these graphics from my Storybook account because I'm too lazy to go into a program and build them myself. Maybe if I like this, that'll be something I'd want to do later. But right now, that does not sound like a fun time for me. So we're gonna let Storybook do the work for me. If you'll refer to the graph, I read 25 books this month, almost 6,000 pages. And this is a breakdown of the types of books they were. This is according to my reviews of them. This is not like a crowd opinion. This is my opinion on what they were. So the majority of them were emotional and lighthearted. I guess a big chunk of them were also mysterious for some reason. As far as book length by page number, the majority of the books that I read were less than 300 pages. I did read a couple of pretty short books, like around 100 pages, maybe a little less, but the majority of the books I read this month, I want to say, were between 100 and 300 pages. I think 225 was about the average. 16% of the books that I read were longer than that. They were about 300 to almost to 500 pages. So I didn't really read a lot of chonkers this month, which is probably why my reading numbers are so high. Okay, moving on. So 84% of the books that I read this month were fiction, and 16% of them were nonfiction, which some people might be disappointed by that, but considering the past year I've had and the fact that I've read mostly fiction, this is actually a pretty good step for me. So I'm actually pretty proud of that 16%. I feel good about that. All right, moving on to a breakdown of genres. The majority of what I've read this month, for almost a whole year, I read almost entirely gay romance. And so that's just one of my favorite subgenres right now. And I don't know when or if that's going to change. So I'm just sticking with it. The next biggest category was fantasy, then mystery, religion. I did read a poetry book. So this one is actually a lot more varied than my previous months have been, simply because I didn't read purely fiction this month. So I feel like this is a good spread for me. It's a good step. All right. Moving on to format. This is incorrect. I know for sure this is. A big giant chunk of the books that I read are digital because I like to read on my phone and I like to read on my Kindle. It's easy, it's portable, and that is the kind of person that I am. This is a surprise. 20% of the books that I read this month were in print format, and that is very new. I have been reading almost exclusively digital, and so the fact that I actually read print books, and some of them were actually from my physical TBR, it's a step forward. It's a good thing. So I was proud of that. And this puts my audiobooks at 4%, but it's actually higher than that. The Sam Allberry book that I talked about at the beginning of the video actually registered as a paperback. I actually listened to it as an audiobook. So that one should be shelved under that. I don't know how to change it in my Storygraph account, and I don't care enough to try. So just know that graph is a tiny bit off, like just a few percentage points, but it's pretty close to the correct stats. Okay, here's my average star rating for the month. And once again, this is relatively arbitrary. Sometimes it is affected by how I'm feeling on the day when I fill out my reviews. So this one has stars all over the map, but for the most part, my highest ratings are in the middle, with being 3.75 or 3 stars even. So that's about what I expect. I don't expect to love everything I read. I find that I don't really have a lot of low rated books because if I don't like it, I typically DNF it. That looks about right. All right, and this is a graph of me driving down a particularly hilly road. As far as my 2023 reading goal, my goal is to read 240 books. That breaks down to about 20 books a month that I need to read in order to reach my goal. And last month, I think I hit it just about on the head. I think I was ahead by maybe 1 or 2 books, but I'm doing pretty good right now. Hopefully I don't hit any slumps or anything. I don't think I will. But my goal is on track. Oh my god, that took so long. Anyhow, if my brand of awkward appeals to you, please feel free to like this video, subscribe to my channel, or follow me on social media, which I will list below. And until next time, tell me about a weird subgenre or trope that you are into, if you want to. Bye.